A billionaire is stranded in the freezing snow until a kid saves his life with one simple trick. Rockford had always been a town that belonged to the cold. In the summer, the forests were lush, the rivers ran clear, and the hills seemed to stretch forever beneath bright blue skies. But when winter came, it came with a vengeance. The snow did not fall gently here. It swallowed everything: roads, rooftops, the world itself. The wind tore through the streets like a living thing, howling against wooden cabins and rattling loose window panes. People knew better than to be caught outside when a blizzard rolled in. It was not just the frostbite or the freezing wind that killed. It was the stillness, the way the cold could drain the life from a man before he even knew he was dying. Daniel Carter had grown up in Rockford, and he understood the dangers of the winter better than most. He had been taught by men who had survived it: his father, a hunter, and his grandfather, a lumberjack. Both had spent their lives in the mountains, reading the land like a book, knowing the difference between a snowfall and a storm that could bury a man alive. But Daniel was not like them. He had never been strong like his father, nor had he been fearless like his grandfather. He was small for his age, quiet and observant. Where other boys wrestled in the snow or swung axes in the yard, Daniel spent his time watching, listening, learning. And because he paid attention, he often saw things before they happened. Tonight, something was going to happen. He could feel it. The storm had been building for days. It started with the wind, the way it shifted, carrying a sharp edge that cut through even the thickest coats. Then the sky, heavy with low, bruised clouds, thick enough to block out the moonlight. And finally, the silence. The woods outside his family's cabin had gone still. No birds, no rustling branches, just an eerie quiet that settled deep in Daniel's bones. Something was coming. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, sending flickering shadows across the walls. The scent of burning wood filled the air, mixing with the lingering aroma of the evening stew. Daniel sat near the fireplace, rubbing his hands together for warmth, when he heard his father's voice from the kitchen. His father was speaking to someone on the phone, his voice low and tense. Daniel could only catch fragments, but it was enough to make his stomach twist. Someone important was coming through town tonight. A man named Richard Vaughn. Daniel knew that name. Everyone in Rockford did. Richard Vaughn was the kind of man whose face appeared in magazines, whose name carried weight in places far from this frozen town. He was a billionaire, a real estate mogul, a man who made decisions that affected people he never met. And now he was coming here, to Rockford, to the mountains. People in town spoke about him with bitterness, their voices edged with anger. Vaughn had been buying up land near the mountain, talking about building some kind of luxury resort. For the townspeople, it was an insult. Rockford was not a place for rich men to turn into a playground. Daniel had never met him, but he didn't need to. He had heard enough to know what kind of man Vaughn was: powerful, untouchable. The kind of man who thought he could bend the world to his will. But he couldn't bend the storm. Daniel listened more closely, trying to piece together the conversation. Vaughn had been scheduled to arrive by helicopter, but with the weather turning worse, the flight had been canceled. That meant only one thing: he was coming by car. A slow, uneasy feeling settled in Daniel's stomach. The mountain road was dangerous on a good day. In a storm like this, it was suicide. The ice on the roads was invisible in places, waiting for the right moment to send a car spinning off the edge. The snow fell so thick that headlights barely cut through it. And if someone did crash, if they were stranded out there in the middle of the storm, they would not last the night. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. His father, still on the phone, barely noticed. His mother, sitting by the table, knitting a thick woolen scarf, glanced up but said nothing. She knew better than to ask questions when Daniel got that look in his eyes. He needed to do something. Daniel grabbed his coat from the hook near the door, yanked on his boots, and wrapped his scarf tightly around his neck. The cold would be brutal tonight, but he did not care. He shoved his hands into his gloves, making sure they were secure. Then he moved toward the door. His mother finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. She asked where he was going. Daniel hesitated. He did not have a real answer, at least, not one that would make sense. He only knew that someone was in danger, that Richard Vaughn was making a mistake, and that no one else seemed to realize how bad this could get. He muttered something about checking the traps in the woods, about making sure the animals were sheltered before the storm hit. It was not a lie, not exactly. His father nodded absently from the kitchen, distracted by the conversation on the phone. His mother's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, then she returned to her knitting. Daniel stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, biting through the fabric of his coat. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved, his breath visible in the air. The wind howled through the trees, whipping against the sides of the cabin. He knew where he had to go. If Vaughn was coming by car, he would be taking the main road up toward the mountain. There was a sharp turn, about 5 miles out, where the road thinned and the drop below was steep. That was the most dangerous spot. If Vaughn hit a patch of ice there, if his tires lost traction for even a second, Daniel did not let himself think about it. He just started moving. The snow was deep, but he pushed forward, his legs working against the resistance. He had walked these woods all his life. He knew the shortcuts, the paths that would get him there faster. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but he did not slow down. Somewhere out there, a man who had never known a real winter was heading straight into one of the worst storms Rockford had seen in years. He had no idea what was waiting for him. But Daniel did, and he was running out of time. Richard Vaughn clenched the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, his jaw tightening as the SUV lurched forward, the tires struggling against the thickening snow. The wipers screeched across the windshield, fighting a losing battle against the flurries that came down in relentless waves. The world outside was disappearing into a swirling white abyss, the road barely visible beneath the mounting frost. He was a man used to control, used to bending circumstances to his will. It was how he had built his empire, how he had turned his name into one spoken with admiration and fear. He was the kind of man who gave orders, not the kind who followed warnings. And yet, here he was. The SUV jerked slightly to the left as the wind slammed against it, nearly pulling the heavy vehicle off course. Vaughn let out a sharp breath, adjusting his grip on the wheel. His pilot had advised against flying. The hotel manager had urged him to delay his trip. Even his own gut had told him this was reckless. But he had ignored them all. He was not the type to change plans because of a little bad weather. Now he was paying for it. The snow was relentless, consuming everything in sight. The road signs had disappeared under thick frost, and the high beams barely cut through the heavy storm. He could feel the temperature dropping inside the cabin, the chill creeping through the vents despite the heater blasting at full power. He flexed his fingers, testing for warmth. They were stiff, slow to respond. This was bad. The storm had turned into something monstrous, an entity all its own. He couldn't see past the hood of the SUV. His entire world had been reduced to the dim glow of the dashboard and the rhythmic pulse of the hazard lights. Every muscle in his body was wound tight, his instincts screaming at him to stop. But stopping was just as dangerous. He pushed forward, the tires groaning as they gripped at the ice-covered asphalt. If he could just reach the next turn, the incline would level out, and he would have a better chance of maintaining control. His hands twitched on the wheel, his mind running calculations, mapping out the road ahead. And then it happened. The rear tires lost traction first, a sudden, gut-wrenching slip. The world shifted violently as the SUV swung sideways, spinning wildly across the road. Vaughn's stomach lurched as the momentum carried him straight toward the edge of the embankment. His muscles locked, his foot slamming the brakes, but it was too late. A moment of weightlessness. Then, impact. The SUV careened down the slope, crashing through snow-covered branches, metal scraping against rock, the sound of twisting steel filling the night. The seatbelt cut into his chest, the force knocking the air from his lungs. His head snapped back against the headrest as the vehicle came to a brutal stop, half buried in the snowdrift. And then, silence. A deep, suffocating stillness settled over everything. Vaughn inhaled sharply, the breath rattling in his chest. Pain lanced through his shoulder as he tried to move, sharp and immediate. He cursed under his breath, his vision swimming. The SUV was tilted awkwardly, one side higher than the other, the front windshield already coated in ice. The cold crept in instantly. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. No signal. The screen flickered uselessly in the darkness. He dropped it onto the passenger seat, his heart pounding in his chest. His head throbbed, his limbs sluggish. This was bad. He tried the door. It wouldn't budge. The weight of the snow pressed against it, sealing him inside. His breathing grew unsteady, fogging up what little glass remained unbroken. The heater was still on, but the warmth was fading fast. He was trapped. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. If no one found him, if no one came looking, he would freeze to death before morning. The temperature was dropping quickly. His fingers were already numb, his movements slow and uncoordinated. His breaths felt thinner, like the cold was stealing the air from his lungs. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay alert. The world had always bent to his will, but out here, in this endless white wilderness, he was powerless. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the SUV like a child's toy. Snow piled higher against the door. Vaughn squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to focus. He had survived worse. He had fought his way out of worse. But this was not a fight he could win with money or influence. Then, through the swirling snow, something moved. A shadow. Small. Fast. His breath hitched. He squinted through the frost-covered windshield, his body tense. Was he hallucinating? His mind, already fogging from the cold, struggled to process what he was seeing. A boy. A child, no older than 13, moving through the storm like he belonged in it. His coat was thick, dusted with fresh snow, and a woolen scarf covered most of his face, but his eyes, sharp and focused, were locked onto Vaughn. The boy didn't hesitate. He trudged through the knee-deep snow, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. He moved quickly, his breath visible in the frigid air. He had seen what happened. He had seen the headlights vanish over the ridge. Vaughn tried to move, but his body was sluggish, the cold slowing his reaction. He watched as the boy reached the driver's side door, planting his feet firmly in the snow. The door wouldn't open. Without missing a beat, the boy yanked off his glove and reached for something inside his coat. A small hunting knife flashed in the dim light as he wedged it into the frozen doorframe, working it carefully, breaking the ice that had already started sealing Vaughn inside. After a few tense moments, the door creaked open. A blast of freezing wind rushed in, cutting through what little warmth remained. Vaughn sucked in a sharp breath as the boy reached in, grabbing his arm. His grip was strong for someone so small. Vaughn barely had the energy to resist. His body was shutting down, his limbs stiff with cold. The boy adjusted his footing, bracing himself before pulling Vaughn forward, his small frame struggling against the weight. Vaughn tried to speak, but his lips barely moved. The boy didn't waste time. He knew what was happening. He had seen it before. The cold was already inside Vaughn's body, slowing him down, dulling his senses. If he didn't act fast, the man would slip into unconsciousness. He needed to get Vaughn warm. Fast. He did the only thing he could think of. Daniel dug his heels into the snow, his boots sinking deep as he dragged Vaughn's half-conscious body away from the wreckage. The man was heavy, dead weight in the boy's grasp, his limbs stiff with cold. Every step was a struggle, the wind lashing against Daniel's exposed face, the snow rising past his knees, making each movement harder than the last. His breath came in sharp gasps, clouds of white mist vanishing into the night. He knew he had to move fast. The cold wasn't just biting anymore, it was devouring. The wind carried a deadly chill, one that seeped through clothes, through skin, straight to the bone. Vaughn's breathing was shallow, his head slumped forward as Daniel hauled him toward a small overhang of trees a few yards away. The SUV was already useless, half buried in the snowdrift, its metal shell turning into a frozen coffin. If they stayed near it, if they stayed exposed, Vaughn wouldn't make it. Daniel's arms ached, his muscles screaming from exertion, but he didn't stop. He forced himself to keep moving, dragging the billionaire further into the natural shelter of the trees. It wasn't much, but at least here, the wind wouldn't cut into them as mercilessly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached a small clearing beneath the thick branches. The snow was piled high, but it was compacted, not as deep as the open ground. It would have to do. Daniel let Vaughn's body down as gently as he could, but the man barely reacted. He was slipping deeper into the cold's grasp, his skin pale, his lips tinged blue. His expensive coat, probably worth more than everything in Daniel's home, was useless now, stiff and ineffective against the brutal storm. Daniel knew the signs of hypothermia. His father had taught him. First came the shivering, then sluggishness, disorientation. If the body got too cold, the mind started playing tricks, making a man think he was burning instead of freezing. That was the final stage, the moment when people stripped off their clothes and welcomed the cold like an old friend. Vaughn wasn't shivering anymore. Daniel's heart pounded. He didn't have much time. He dropped to his knees, frantically clearing the snow away, making a small depression in the frozen earth. Fire wasn't an option, not in this wind. The moment he struck a match, the flames would be snatched away, useless against the storm's wrath. He needed another way. His father's lessons echoed in his mind. If you ever get caught out in the cold with someone freezing to death, don't waste time trying to build a fire. You won't have enough fuel, and you won't have enough time. The only way to stop them from slipping away is warmth. Your warmth. Daniel's fingers trembled as he reached for the buttons on Vaughn's coat, yanking them open. The billionaire didn't resist. His body was shutting down, his skin deathly cold beneath the layers of fabric. Daniel swallowed hard. He had no choice. He shrugged off his own coat, ignoring the way the cold immediately clawed at him, wrapping Vaughn's frozen form inside its thick insulation. Then he pressed his small frame against the man's chest, feeling the icy skin beneath his fingertips, the barely there rise and fall of Vaughn's breath. He tucked the woolen blanket around them both, wrapping it as tightly as he could. The heat from his own body was the only thing keeping Vaughn from crossing the point of no return. The man barely stirred. His breathing was shallow, weak. Daniel gritted his teeth, adjusting his position, pressing closer. He could feel Vaughn's heart, faint, sluggish, as if it, too, was struggling to keep going. He wasn't going to let him die. Minutes passed, each one stretching endlessly. The cold gnawed at Daniel, sapping his strength. He forced himself to stay awake, to keep his breathing steady. His arms ached, his legs numb, but he didn't move. He focused on Vaughn's heartbeat. Slow, but still there. The wind howled through the trees, the snow piled higher around them. Daniel closed his eyes for just a moment, listening to the storm rage on. And then, through the relentless cold, he felt something. A small shift. A tremor. Vaughn's body shuddered against him. The first real movement in what felt like hours. A flicker of life. Daniel tightened his hold. He wasn't going to let him go. The storm did not let up. It raged with relentless fury, a beast made of wind and ice, clawing through the trees, howling across the mountains. Snow fell in thick, blinding waves, piling higher, pressing in around the two figures buried beneath a single woolen blanket. The night stretched endlessly, an unforgiving test of endurance. Daniel did not sleep. He couldn't. His body ached, his fingers burned with cold, and his breath came out in shallow, uneven puffs. But he did not loosen his grip. He could still feel the slow, struggling rhythm of Vaughn's heartbeat beneath him. Weak, but present. That was all that mattered. Time lost meaning. The cold made everything sluggish, his limbs heavy, his thoughts drifting in and out of focus. The weight of exhaustion pressed on him, whispering to him to close his eyes, to rest. But he knew better. He had been taught what happened to those who fell asleep in the snow. They never woke up. So he forced himself to stay awake. He shifted his position now and then, pressing closer, listening for any change in Vaughn's breathing. Every so often a tremor would go through the man's body. A good sign. His body was still fighting. But Daniel didn't know how much longer they could last. The storm felt endless. The wind roared, rattling the branches above them. It was the kind of night that swallowed men whole, leaving nothing but frozen remains beneath the ice. Daniel wasn't sure if his plan would work. He had read about it in survival books, had heard his father mention it before, skin-to-skin warmth, sharing body heat, preventing the cold from taking hold completely. But Vaughn wasn't a man made for the cold. He had spent his life in heated cars, in grand buildings with controlled temperatures. And yet, he had survived the night. Daniel didn't know when the storm finally broke. He was too tired to mark the exact moment. But at some point the howling winds grew softer, the snowfall less frantic. Slowly, the world beyond the trees emerged once more, shaped in hues of blue and white beneath the weak morning light. The first thing Daniel registered was the silence. The storm was gone. His limbs felt impossibly heavy as he forced himself to sit up. His muscles protested, aching from the long hours of stillness. His breath caught in his throat as he turned his gaze toward Vaughn. The billionaire had not moved. His face was pale, his skin nearly blending with the snow surrounding them. For one awful moment, Daniel thought he had failed. Then, movement. A sharp, shallow inhale. Vaughn stirred, his fingers twitching against the blanket wrapped around him. His eyelids fluttered, his expression tightening as if coming back into himself was an effort. Daniel exhaled shakily, relief making his own body sag. Vaughn was alive. Slowly, the man's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, glassy with lingering exhaustion and cold. Then, awareness began to settle in. His gaze shifted, landing on Daniel, still sitting beside him, still holding on to him as if afraid to let go. For a long moment, Vaughn said nothing. His entire body felt stiff, his limbs aching as he struggled to sit up. His mind was sluggish, trying to piece together where he was, what had happened. The last thing he remembered was the storm, the crash, the cold swallowing him whole. And now, he was still here. Vaughn blinked, the full weight of realization settling over him. He was alive. He had survived, and the boy sitting next to him, thin, exhausted, but somehow still upright, was the reason why. Daniel pulled back slightly, his limbs shaking with exhaustion. His coat was still wrapped tightly around Vaughn, the only real protection the billionaire had left. Vaughn glanced down at the fabric, as if only now realizing that Daniel had given up his own warmth to keep him alive. The wind had softened, but the air was still frigid. Snow stretched out in all directions, untouched and pristine in the morning light. A sound broke the silence, the faint, distant hum of something approaching. Daniel turned his head, his tired eyes scanning the horizon. A helicopter. Rescue crews. Searching for the missing billionaire. Vaughn sat up fully, forcing his stiff muscles to obey. He could see it now, the dark shape of the aircraft cutting through the sky, moving toward them. Help was coming, but Vaughn barely registered it. His focus remained on Daniel. A boy, a stranger, someone who should have had no reason to help him, to risk his own life for a man he had never met. And yet, he had. Vaughn had spent his life believing in power, in control, in self-preservation. He had clawed his way to the top, built an empire on the principle that a man made his own fortune, owed nothing to anyone. But now, he owed everything to a boy from a town he had planned to erase. And that was a debt he could never repay. The helicopter drew closer, the sound of the rotors growing louder. Soon, men in thick coats would descend, would lift Vaughn to safety, would wrap him in heated blankets and return him to the world he knew. But something inside him had changed. As Daniel sat back, exhaustion finally overtaking him, Vaughn knew that no amount of money, no business deal, no grand gesture could ever make them even. He had been saved not by power, not by money, but by kindness. And for the first time in his life, Richard Vaughn had nothing to say. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of kindness, survival, and the power of simple yet life-saving actions. Its purpose is to inspire compassion and remind us that true wealth lies in humanity and helping others, no matter their status.